I mean, firstly, I just wanted to thank Queer Disrupt for inviting me to speak, and to Scienta and Hannah for hosting the panel. Before I begin, I did just want to say that I'm going to be mentioning and showing some depictions of gore and necrophilia and horror. So there'll also be some discussion of racism, of misogyny, transphobia and ableism. So if these are things that you'd rather not see today, then please feel free to take 15 minutes away from the panel. I definitely won't be offended. With all that out of the way, I do have to confess that this paper is sort of doubling as a group therapy session for me, in that my interest in critiquing mainstream representations of drag has grown out of my discomfort and my increasing discomfort as a drag performer, trying to navigate the ever-increasing demands and expectations which I've experienced performing in various spaces and settings over the last few years. But in what follows, I do not intend to denigrate or undermine the talent of any drag artist in the public eye. As cliche as it sounds, all drag really is valid, but it is this oft-quoted soundbite which frames my critique, and in light of which I would like to question how the recent emergence of drag as a lucrative industry, in inverted commas, in neoliberal economies relates to issues of representation, inclusivity, capital, and queerness. Perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, actually, we're not going to start with the Boulet brothers' Dragula, but with the significantly more well-known and lucrative elephant in the room, RuPaul's Drag Race. Since it sashayed onto our screens in 2009, it's frequently been praised as marking a sea change in queer representation, placing the experiences of queer people centre stage before an ever-expanding and increasingly international audience. But such representation comes at a cost. And indeed, I think we should ask who or what exactly Drag Race can be said to represent, if at all. Writing in 2011, Iran Edgar observed how the show, then in its third season, was positioning itself, quote, as the official reality television show for queer America, demonstrating the permissible forms of drag and gender performance. This vision of queer America, though, has revealed itself to be deeply exclusionary. Drag Race premiered on Logo, a cable network catering to, quote, lesbians and gays. That is to say, towards a middle-class demographic more capable of approximating homonormative presentations and lifestyles. We might note the absence in this description of multi-gender sexual attractions and significantly trans and gender non-conforming identities. And this sort of exclusionary model has been hardwired into the show since it began. It only features drag queens, and aside from the widely reported transphobic comments which RuPaul has made, and which I definitely don't want to give time of day today, it's been repeatedly called out for perpetuating transphobic and misogynistic discourses, using phrases such as fishy and you've got she-male. Now, since I began developing the paper, the show has started to actively represent trans and non-binary bodies in a more positive way, although that does raise new questions both of tokenism and why it took quite so long for Drag Race to do it at all. So despite its apparently progressive nature, Drag Race, in the words of Kay Kolsdorf, makes drag safe and confines gender transgression within heteronormative discourses as well as binary codes. Indeed, Drag Race upholds the neoliberal cis-heteropatriarchal hegemony by policing what constitutes legitimate drag expression. In so doing, it offers a vision of what Jose Esteban Munoz called commercial drag, which he defined, quote, as a sanitized and desexualized queer subject for mass consumption, representing a certain strand of integrationist liberal pluralism. Failures to approximate idealized feminine beauty standards have, as Phoebe Chetwynd demonstrates, frequently fallen foul of the judges in RuPaul's Drag Race. In the second series of the UK version of the show, the contestant Ginny Lemon was seen being pressured into adopting a more glamorous style, and recently they criticised the show for exploiting their non-binary identity, perhaps in order to create a storyline. In the sixth season of the show's US version, Milk, a performer who is known for their androgynous style, was told to remove their beard and was praised for wearing, quote, pretty makeup. Now this amounts, in Chetwynd's words, to a post-feminist reassertion of the gender binary. Idealized femininity is associated with consumerism and consumption, whether in product placements, celebrity judges, the use of the show as a vehicle for promoting RuPaul's music career, or the lucrative tours and conventions which Drag Race has spawned. So it's perhaps ironic then that in this context, contestants invoke the concept of realness. In recent articles, Meredith Heller and Benny Lemaster have explored how realness, which is a term that originated in the theatrical performance of unattainable and idealized identities by members of the New York ballroom scene, primarily trans and people of color, has been reappropriated to denote not just beauty, but the acquisition of capital and material wealth through competing on Drag Race. To update Edgar's quote a decade later then, we might say that Drag Race now positions itself as the official reality television show, not just for queer America, but for all America and beyond. It therefore engages audiences in the active policing of drag artistry, encouraging them to support and valorize one small part of the spectrum of drag performance couched in the neoliberal discourse of realness. Despite the apparent inescapability of RuPaul's empire, though, an alternative way of understanding realness might be revealed by another competition, namely the Boulet brothers' Dragula. Dragula positions itself as a celebration of all things punk and monstrous, intent on demolishing any and every notion of sanitized, idealized beauty. It situates itself in a long tradition, including the Wrecking Queens of Atlanta in the 1960s, Divine's Reign of Terror in the films of John Waters in the 1970s and 1980s. I propose that Dragula, like these earlier antecedents, can be read through a Lacanian and Christovan lens, in which the neoliberal construction of gendered norms and binaries underpinning the symbolic order is annihilated by the revelation of the horrific real, the fact that gender is not binary, that beauty is not determinable, and that for all the makeup and wigs in the world, we can't conceal the flesh and blood beneath our skin. In Powers of Horror, Christopher identifies the abject in objects, processes, or images which provoke reactions of disgust, horror, and fear. Think gruesome bodily emissions, vomit, blood, semen, and feces, the image of a corpse. If beauty is what's on the inside, then the abject is surely the epitome of glamour in its rawest, starkest form. Christopher defines the abject as, quote, a massive and sudden emergence of uncanniness, which now harries me as radically separate, loathsome. Not me, not that, but not nothing either, as something that I do not recognize as a thing, a weight of meaningless about which there is nothing insignificant and which crushes me, on the edge of non-existence and hallucination of a reality that, if I acknowledge it, annihilates me. This me is a socially constructed and gendered subject, its certainties of self firmly inscribed in the aesthetic and behavioral norms of cis and heteronormative representation. Indeed, Constance Kutbach and Monica Müller note that, quote, in cultural production, what is perceived as disgusting or unaesthetic is often correlated with insight into the instability and the fragmentary nature of the self. To represent the abject, to glorify the abject, is, they say, to aestheticize the unaesthetic. So before we go into exploring Dragula, I thought I'd just play the trailer for the show's most recent series. I'm aware that everyone will have different levels of being comfortable with kind of gore and horror, so I've tried to find the nicest, most least kind of horrendous one out there.
Monster.
So throughout the show, it's going again. There we go. Throughout the show, contestants embody the abject, becoming a physical manifestation of the monstrous status assigned to queer people, and particularly to those who defy cis-heteronormative scripts. In this picture, we see Victoria Black, who has just removed a prosthetic face painted according to normative gendered beauty standards to reveal the horrifyingly gory reality of her anatomy. In this way, her performance challenges the idea that drag performers should approximate such hegemonic beauty norms. Rather, by forcing the audience to confront the physically represented abject, a performer can disrupt the traditional structure of gender, breaking with the more widely represented and praised journey from conventionally attractive cis man to conventionally beautiful real woman. If Drag Race compels its performers to realize, in post-feminist terms, their inner potential and beauty, artists like Victoria take this notion of inner beauty to terrifyingly literal levels. Later in the series, Victoria mounts and rides a skinless corpse before licking and writhing around in the remnants of its small intestines, delighting in the physical encounter with putrefying flesh. A similarly horrified reaction would surely be produced by performers like Bitch Puddin, seen here dressed in overalls eating the contents of a sewer. Disturbing the viewer, these performances elicit the kind of reaction which Christopher attributes to the abject, and in doing so they disrupt the popular misconception that drag is merely ludic. Instead, they confirm that drag has a powerful potential to unsettle and undermine the foundations of the symbolic order, the very foundations on which cisgenderism rests. However, the contestants of Dragula are also tasked with embodying glamour. How might they approximate the runway-ready realness of their contemporaries on Drag Race? Well, simply, I don't think that they try to. Their art seeks to redefine the meaning of glamour, liberating it from the trappings of the heteronormative gaze through which modern beauty standards are so often filtered. A beautiful gown is soiled with its wearer's blood, which oozes from their body as a raven picks off part of the piece. Or a supermodel, who seems to be drawn straight out of a 1960s fashion book, reveals herself to be a bloodthirsty and blood-soaked vampire. These embodiments of the abject are a direct critique of the violent and corrosive effects of internalizing cis-heteronormative beauty standards. The psychological disfiguration which such standards cause is now expressed in physical forms. If Drag Race reinforces the unrealistic beauty standards associated with the ideal consumerist modern woman, Dragula parodies and distorts and disrupts this hegemonic aesthetic order. The cracks in the symbolic are wrenched apart by these so-called supermonsters, whose ability to embody the abject opens up an alternative space that we might conclude is as real as it gets. But having said all this, I'm not sure that such a clear-cut and perhaps extreme conclusion is desirable or convincing. It would definitely be naive to think that Dragula is some sort of perfect paradigm of queer representation in the context of neoliberal systems of oppression, which have historically sought to eradicate LGBT identities, which now seek to sanitize and incorporate those same identities into their aesthetic codes. The show is ultimately a commercial product. It's been distributed on Amazon Prime and Netflix. It spawned merchandise, a podcast, and world tours. Moreover, racism continues to rear its ugly head in the interactions between fans and performers, and sometimes between performers themselves. Add to this that structural ableism is as prevalent on Dragula as it is on almost every other reality competition. Many of their so-called extermination and on-location challenges are simply inaccessible in their design to disabled bodies. Perhaps then the countercultural flag which the Boulets claim to fly is no more than a rhetorical posture intended to set their brand apart. But this conclusion might be going too far in the other direction. Certainly there is much to critique. But as Jessica Archambault writes, activists should not lose sight of what she calls small victories in representation. In contrast to the narrow definitions of drag long imposed by RuPaul and his team of casters, Dragula has welcomed kings, queens, and everything in between from its very inception. The Boulets also remind competitors, quote, that drag is art and art is subjective. Whereas Drag Race contestants are scrutinized for failing to conceal their genitalia or for being, quote, unpolished, the Boulets create a diverse spectrum of drag and specifically relate their critiques to the themes and the criteria of each weekly challenge. The difference between the two shows is perhaps best epitomized by the Boulets' claim that a Drag Race Dragula crossover would look like hell freezing over. No more important is the question of whether queerness has to be anti-capitalist, or if the act of championing and representing queer voices and businesses within the neoliberal order remains a radical act in itself. If the neoliberal capitalist order discriminates against trans, gender non-conforming and bodies of colour, does the inclusion of a diverse cast of competitors in a competition ultimately oriented towards financial reward serve to redress in some small way these imbalances? Or might the punk countercultural stance for which the Boulets advocate not be better expressed by actively fighting against the order in which Dragula is inscribed? I certainly don't intend to gatekeep any definition of queerness by suggesting that contestants on one show are somehow more authentic or queer than on another, and nor do I or anyone have the right to demand that anyone who is queer goes out into the street and demands the fall of the banks. The ability to critique the neoliberal order is ultimately a luxury, and many queers, not least trans artists and people of colour, do not have that luxury. For many in our community, the battle to achieve recognition and remuneration in the capitalist economy is not a luxury, but a matter of survival. Which brings me back to conclude to my own internal conflicts as a drag performer. There's nothing I love more than turning the stage into a place for disruption, whether I'm writhing around in homemade slime or coating my body in shit. The legacy of artists such as Divine and the contestants of Dragula has absolutely influenced my own artistic development. So why have I just agreed to be paid to do a beauty feature for the local shopping centre's Pride magazine? It's definitely not because I love the idea of a corporate Pride month, and I really do quite hate navigating the gender binaries in Primark, but quite simply, I needed the money to fund my own show, a show that I can perform exactly how I want to. And this decision caused a lot of internal conflict, but as a dear friend reminded me, there's no point fetishizing the image of the starving artist. We're all still chipping away at the walls of an oppressive and powerful system, and the need to prioritize personal and financial security weighs heavy on the shoulders of many in the queer community. But shows like Dragula remind us that there is a world of drag beyond the glitzy and glamorous universe of RuPaul's Drag Race. The representation provided by Dragula shows that drag can still do something radical, and even when we are unable to express such radical potential in our own lives, we can perhaps live vicariously by watching the monstrous performances of Bitch Pudding, Saint, or Victoria Black. As we cautiously come out of lockdown and edge towards something approaching and return to normal, let's embrace the spirit of the Boulets by supporting artists whose drag exists to disconcert, to disturb, and in the spirit of this conference, to queer disrupt.